Yama, everyone watching, and welcome to the Children's Grounds Teaching Truth-Telling panel. Webinar, sorry. I'm Madeline Heyman-Reba. I'm Comms and Partnerships Coordinator at Children's Grounds. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Larrakia people here in Garramilla and Darwin. And I would like to acknowledge their elders past, present, and those on the grounds doing great things for their communities. We have three deadly panelists to share their perspectives and experiences with truth-telling. Unfortunately, Anton was called away for work, but we have the incredible Cherisse Buzzcott stepping in place of him. So I'll now get our panelists to tell us like whose country you're on and a little bit about you and your qualifications. Yeah, whatever you want to say. We'll start with Cherisse, sorry.
Hello everyone. My name's Cherisse Buzzcott. I work at Children's Ground. I work as the head of health and wellbeing here in Central Australia. I'm an Aranda woman, so I'm really lucky to call Aranda country my home and be able to work here with my family. I'm a mom of 3 boys, and yeah, I'm previously worked as a midwife, so I've worked in hospital in the systems and just wanted to do something working on the ground and working with families and communities and just trying to make a change from the ground. And yeah, I'm thankful for being here to be able to talk to you today and hopefully share a bit about the work that we've been doing at Children's Ground and also the work that I do and just my journey around truth telling as well. Thanks.
Anthea, do you want to go next?
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name's Anthea Edmunds. I'm dialing in from one Jerryborough region of the Yugambeh region, which is Tamborine Mountain behind the Gold Coast. And I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Thank you for having me on the panel. My husband is Aboriginal, Russell. He's Pitjantjatjara and Cookatha, so Central Desert. He grew up on Amiwara Mission in the late 60s, and we've got 2 beautiful children, Winter Lily Malkocha, who's 10, and Bailey Yanama, who is 6. And I think, you know, Russell not having that access to education growing up has placed a real importance on education and educating our kids. And our kids have a real love of school. And so Winter was recently Musician of the Week and Student of the Week. And so really placing importance of the young ones and educating the young ones. And I'm just really happy to be on this panel with everybody. Thank you for having me.
And Cassie.
Hi everyone, my name is Cassie. I was born on Noongar Whadjuk country in Perth, but I'm dialing in from Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country in Naarm, and I feel so lucky to be on this country where there's so much wisdom and song spirals and song lines that I benefit from every day and I'm constantly learning from as a white Jewish educator. I studied psychology and a Master's of Teaching, and I'm a progressive Jewish educator, so I grew up volunteering at and mentoring in an egalitarian Jewish community group, and we focused on ideas of leadership, culture, social action, and truth-telling was a big part of the narrative and the content that we explored. So I'm really keen to share with you my insights and obviously learn so much and listen from the other incredible panelists today. I've also worked at both independent Jewish and government schools as a teacher, so I'm really passionate about embedding a trauma-informed practice framework and approach into our education system.
Cool. Thank you for that. I also just wanted to mention if anyone watching has any questions throughout the panel, just pop them in the Q&A box. And also I forgot to say at the start, if you know whose country you're on, because I did see someone, Claire, I think, yeah, Claire wrote where she was zooming in from. So if you'd like to share where you're zooming in from, you can use the chat box to do that. So we will start with Cherisse. I'd like to ask you, can you explain to everyone what kind of truth-telling work you do at Children's Grounds and why it's important?
I guess big part of the work that we're doing is around acknowledging the real history of the country. We did a really good exercise at the start of this year as a team with First Nations and non-First Nations staff in kind of mapping out the events from colonisation, so from when the first boats arrived right through to, you know, as recently as last year. Just kind of mapping all of the events of what had happened in terms of policy and legislation. We also talked about some of the things that we thought that were not well known. So like some of the untruths around like some of the massacres and deaths of people, especially specifically around Central Australia, but also from across Australia. So as a group, as a team, we've done that as an exercise to try and, I guess what we're trying to do is have that understanding of the reason why, you know, our communities are the way that they are. They're so disempowered. And, you know, we're just trying to, I guess, own some of that truths of what's happened in the past so that we can use that to push us to kind of get to where we want to go at Children's Ground. And just with the truth telling aspect, I've always been someone who speaks very truthful about things. If I see things happening, I'm very likely to call them out. And so I feel, you know, that's my role, being someone who's Western educated, to give a voice. I don't want to give a voice to people, but I want to make a space so that people can have a voice and be able to share, I guess, some of their experiences, and, you know, just talking through some of the issues that a lot of the communities, and including my families, are, you know, dealing with at the moment. And I've been seeing a lot in the media that's been happening around in Bandwa. A lot of the East Coast people have made comments saying, you know, what's happening in Alice Springs, and is it really this bad? And so I just want to give space for people to be able to tell what, you know, their truth about their experience and what their families are going through. And I guess that's, you know, that Children's Ground philosophy is that it's all Aboriginal led, you know, it's First Nations led, and that's the way that we operate. And the way that we do that is we acknowledge our elders and our ancestors, and we, you know, I don't speak out of turn. There are people that speak before me when I go into a room, and acknowledging that. And I think that's where, I guess, some of that truth telling falls down, and that we've got people that are coming up and spreading a lot of really bad mistruths about our mob. So yeah, just giving space. And I think Children's Ground does that really well through the work that we're doing. And starting with little ones, you know, starting with the kids and making sure that they have a voice from the very beginning, whereas a lot of their parents and grandparents have been voiceless for so long.
And Cherisse, as a Black mother, how do you approach educating your own kids on the history of this country?
I'm very honest about things with my kids, and I don't, there's nothing that my kids aren't involved in. If we're, you know, driving down the street and we see a Black man being arrested and going into a paddy wagon, my sons are quite vocal, and they get quite emotional and upset, because most of the time likely that this person has either, you know, has probably been just kind of drunk and causing a scene, and so they appreciate that, you know, people are only in a certain situation because that's what the systems have designed to put them into this situation where, you know, this person is getting arrested. So my kids are quite knowledgeable about things. I never used to shy away from, you know, telling my kids about being Black and where they're from and who they connect with, and just being really mindful about, you know, when we see people down the street and, you know, or we see people that are, you know, that might be going through a bit of a hard time, I'm very honest to my kids about, you know, this is someone who, you know, needs our help, or this is someone who we should be looking out for, not someone who we should shy away from or be ashamed of, especially when their family come up to them in the street. You know, just being really respectful of people, and regardless of the, you know, what kind of state they're in. So, you know, I've always been quite honest with my kids, and they're really proud to be living on Aranda country and learning a bit of Aranda, and their dad's Walpri, so they're doing a little bit of Walpri as well. And I think, you know, just being proud of who they are and having that identity, because I had a bit of that, but I think like most of us, we were, you know, certain circles, you'd be, you know, bit shy to talk about who you were or to disclose that you were Aboriginal. And that was me kind of all the way through growing up. I'd had different phases of wanting to acknowledge being an Aboriginal, but then also shying away from it in different circles. And so I just want my kids to be proud in whatever situation they are. And also to stand up if they see injustices and they see things that they, you know, don't agree with, or things that they might think that, oh, my mum said this, or about this situation, that maybe they can speak up for someone who, you know, they might end up saving someone's life one day just by being able to express themselves, and just be really truthful about who they are. So I really love, my kids are just in that phase of just learning and wanting to know everything. And, you know, there's nothing that I don't tell my kids. I just love to be really open and honest with them, because I think the more of us that are, the less likely, you know, we are to get to put down, or the less likely, you know, my kids are, when they stand up and say something, they're going to have more people that then stand up and agree with them and support them and back them. So we just have to be really honest about, you know, the way things are, and this is how they are. And, you know, by pushing my kids out, I know I'm putting them into a vulnerable spot, but I'm hoping that through Children's Ground, we're just creating more and more voices that can all back each other up.
And Anthea, as a white mum of Aboriginal kids, how do you better educate yourself?
Thanks, Maddie, and thanks, Cherisse. Always love hearing from you. You always say so many really insightful things, so thank you. So as a white mother, how do I go about educating myself? One of the things that I try and do, I mean, I learn so much from not only my husband and my kids every day, but also really ensuring that we've got a lot of books by Aboriginal authors, First Nations authors, both here in Australia and First Nations globally, and also persons of colour books all across the world. And so I know that Auntie Joy is one of our patrons of Children's Ground, and so Auntie Joy's got a beautiful book for younger kids, Welcome to Country. And so in the younger ones, that's a really nice one to have. So I think it's about educating both your kids, but also specifically as a white, if you're a white parent, educating yourself as well. And so I'm constantly trying to read and educate myself. And one that Winter and I have been reading together is actually a really nice one. Winter's really enjoyed this one. It's called Dream Big and Imagine the What If by Kylie Captain. And I think she's got a new one that's coming out as well. And as an educator, I think that it's really good for teachers as well to read this one. So that one's been really great to sort of read together. But and a few other ones that I've got for when they start to get a little bit older is this series is really beautiful. It's about astrology, song lines, country and design. And I think they've just got another one or two that are coming out in that series. But just having a heap of different books. I think the first book that I ever got put on was one of Russell's really good friends, who's Professor Tracy Bunda at the University of Queensland. And about 2011, I think, before I'd even ever gone out on country with Russell, he took me to Professor Tracy, and she suggested that I read a book called Sovereign Subjects, which is curated or edited by distinguished Professor Aileen Mortensen Robinson, and it's got a number of different authors, and Professor Bunda had a chapter in that about the sovereign Aboriginal woman, and that book's actually a really good one to start with as well if you're early on in your journey. It's got a lot of really excellent authors in that, and that actually really started me on realizing how much I've got to educate myself. And then I just started reading and reading a lot of books. The other one that's a really important book for us as white women, or white people in general, but particularly, it's called Talking Up to the White Woman, again by Professor Aileen Morton Robinson. And this is a really, really important book. So start educating yourself and don't be scared to sort of take on board and learn everything that you can. And Chelsea What It Goes, Another Day in the Colony is also a really great book as well. So sometimes I think as white women can get quite nervous or don't necessarily like to sort of hear that phrase, but just do the work and read the books. It's really important for us as a country to acknowledge that the hurts from colonization, and that's really important for your kids. So if you're an educator or if you're a parent. And then also having like a really large range of books that are on, Indigenous knowledges. So one really good one's called Fire Country by Victor Stephenson. And it's a really great way to understand sort of the technicalities, and written really well about specific Indigenous knowledges as well. And I really enjoyed this one. I've got the CD of this as well. So it's called Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta. And I've listened to that because it's quite complex and getting it over in my head. And the other thing I do to educate myself is I'm halfway through postgrad law, so I'm doing a Juris Doctor online. It's taking me a little bit longer, but to really understand colonization and Indigenous, all the effects that's had on colonization's had on here in Australia. So that's a long-term learning. But even if you don't want to do postgrad law, I think it's just really important as white people in Australia, or non-Indigenous or non-First Nations in general, to really make sure that you're buying authors, First Nations authors, always like reading and learning, supporting businesses, supporting Aboriginal small businesses and all that sort of thing. So I've got a whole heap of other books, but I won't pull them all out. So that's one of the things that I think that we can do, is to just like educate ourselves and constantly be learning and learning, and that's me.
Oh, and Cassie, I was wondering how you, when do you start introducing challenging concepts to young people? Because obviously you would have First Nations stuff here, but also in your Jewish schools, like things like Palestine or the Holocaust.
Great question. Firstly, just want to give some airtime to Anthea's amazing book recommendations. I feel like you should almost send those out to all of us, and we can subscribe to your like weekly or monthly list.
Yeah.
Super awesome.
Anthea's book club.
Yeah, definitely. But Maddie, it's such a great question to return to what you were saying about when do you introduce these really challenging concepts that really at the center are about truth telling, and also at the center of how we can make our society a more just place, regardless of what community has been marginalized in that narrative. So I can only speak from lived experience as a Jewish educator and within Jewish contexts. And I would say that there are many factors as to when you introduce it. I think firstly, it's about how the family within that school community will receive that material. There are some communities in the Jewish community from experience that are very progressive and are very open to hearing critiques of history or certain perspectives, where there are some communities that might be a bit more esoteric or a bit more insular and don't really want to be challenged in terms of how history has been portrayed and how these facts are being delivered. So from my experience, it's less about when and it's more about how. It's about, are we introducing the content through a trauma-informed lens? So for example, is the content we're introducing, is that going to create more trauma and more shock for the students at their developmental stage? So we really, as teachers, need to know our students well and to really value where they're coming from and their context. I think another thing is important to think about how we're doing it is what sources we're choosing to use. So for example, we know that history is represented through the eye of the perpetrator a lot of the time, and that people who are victims and people who went through that adversity and that challenge, their voices aren't really heard as much, or they're not in the center of the discussion. So I think as teachers, we need to really highlight survivors' testimonies. And I think from experience as a Jewish educator, that's something we really value. We get people who have survived the Holocaust or have survived adversity with their experience of Jewish faith to come and speak with children and to do it in a way that is very relaxed, very informal, sitting in a circle. Children can ask, obviously at a certain age, it would make sense to do this, a bit older, in terms of if we're, having Holocaust survivors come and talk. I personally, from experience, wouldn't have them come speak, in an early learning setting. I think it's really important just to be mindful of developmentally when we introduce these topics. But if they're at an age appropriate, based on the context of the school, they come in and the Holocaust survivors can speak to their experience. And as Cherisse said, kids are curious and kids ask questions, and we should really encourage that. We should encourage kids to ask questions about their history and their experience. So I know I didn't really answer, what, but I think it's more just about being how and introducing it with a critical lens and allowing, being aware of the student's context and also the parents as well in these conversations.
Thank you, Cassie. Just one for Anthea and Cherisse, I guess. What experiences have you had with the schooling system in this country, like in terms of educating your children on their own history?
So with the school, the kids are at a really good school at the moment, which really, there's quite a lot of Aboriginal families that go to this school. It's a sort of lower socioeconomic school with so lots of multicultural, different diverse families that are attending the school. So they do really well on the the NAIDOC weeks and the reconciliation week, and getting language speakers in, and doing, every assembly does an acknowledgement of country, which is really good. So, you know, they do really good on that, in that it's changed a lot since I was at school, in that they're inclusive of all of that stuff. In terms of, you know, I guess teaching the history, there's not really that much, you know, there's not really that much in the school that acknowledges the real history. And I guess when they do history at school, it's all about, you know, a big thing is the telegraph station. So we've got the bungalow, which was a mission for Aboriginal kids that were kind of taken away and kind of forced into Catholicism or Christianity. And what happened, you know, what happens is they do a little excursion out there at the telegraph station, but it's more about learning, you know, what the telegraph station was set up for, and you know, like the family that was involved, which is a white settler family, and how they lived, and kids get to role play. And then they've got, you know, they've got the women, the young women who would have been the Aboriginal women, the workers back in the day, that, you know, they're the ones that they do all the cleaning, and so they're outside cleaning and collecting water. And then you've got the people that are playing the cookie, they're in the kitchen. And so, you know, it just kind of touches on it briefly. It doesn't really explore it kind of in depth. And I think even looking at, I've got, you know, older, I guess they're my younger cousins, but older than my kids, that are in school, and they're not really learning anything really truthful about the history. And I think they're having little acknowledgement here or there. You know, we had the Coniston massacre, which was just north of here. So there's a small little bit of acknowledgement, but not much. And even in terms of language, like they did do some Aranda at school, but every year it changes. So like one of my sons was doing Aranda last year, this year he's doing Chinese. So, you know, putting value on, you know, our first languages and our history is something that's really important. And I'd love to see more of it. It's just not something that we see all the time, which is why, you know, if I have an opportunity to take my sons out with Children's Ground, you know, I love to do that. If I can do that once a month for either one of my boys, you know, for me, that would be just enough for them. And I guess the education and truth telling, that's stuff that has to come from me and my family, because I don't think we're going to get that, you know, in the school to the extent that I would like to see. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Cherisse. I think that there is a little bit, like you said, there's probably a lot of room to grow, and that's an opportunity, and that'll be exciting to see. Yeah, there's been instances where we've probably both, Russell and I, have called stuff out at the school, and they've been really receptive. I think one time an incident happened, and I just called the school and I said, one of the challenges is like that adultification of Aboriginal girls, young girls, like treating Aboriginal girls as older. So maybe that the white student wouldn't have got treated in the same way as my daughter got treated, and that was a really important thing that they needed to be aware of, to not sort of, you know, do that. And that was sort of taken on board. And then I think there was another time that Russell went down to the school and sort of pointed out their values, and sort of called something else out as well. And they've been really respectful. But, you know, as an Aboriginal dad, like Russell's so involved in he's on the PNC committee, and he's like the suckle mum, and he's at everything, and he's always there picking the kids up and dropping them off. And again, I think that comes from that history of, you know, not getting access to education when he was young, and placing the importance of that. And I think that that's its own kind of, not necessarily reconciliation, but like him being such an important part of the school, and knowing every parent and teacher, and that's a really important part of that as well. So I think there's it does happen a little bit in the schools about teaching, but that there is a little way to go, and I think that that'll be exciting to see when that goes. And in terms of, I think a question might have popped up about the early years. I know that when the kids were in like the prep, no, the kindy before school, they did really nice acknowledgements that were kid friendly, that everyone would stand around and hold hands and do the here is the land, here is the sky, here are my friends, and here am I sort of acknowledgement, which was a nice introduction for, you know, really tiny little ones as well. And I think that in the early years they also would get like local aunties to come in and do things, and they had a lot of Aboriginal artwork as well in that. So I think it does sort of feed into from those kindy and early years stages into the schools. And yes, so I think it's an exciting place to watch, because there's so much amazing opportunity there.
Cassie, so when you do, going back to what you were saying before, when you are educating kids on these difficult subjects. What do you think people need to be aware of as an educator when exploring that content?
So I think they need to firstly be aware of their own biases. I think we as educators, as much as some people say education isn't political, I think it is a very political act. I think to choose to be an educator, you are choosing to present certain narratives and certain voices. So I think as an educator, I'd like to be reflective and think about, okay, what biases do I have? What prior experience or knowledge do I have that might actually prevent me from engaging with this, or to actually be sharing the truth and be wholeheartedly truth-telling? So that would probably be my first thing, is just to assess your bias and also assess your privilege. Assess if you are, if you have the knowledge to be sharing this content, and if you don't, then you should be asking support and guidance from an expert who has lived experience or who is a knowledge holder. So that would be my my first thing in terms of where I would go with bias and just what narrative you're presenting. I think I spoke to it a bit in the previous answer, but I think selection of sources is crucial, because you might be perpetuating a certain narrative or certain facts that aren't true. And that's the whole idea of truth telling, is that we have to avert that system of saying, well, just because this is written in a textbook, or just because this has been discussed in schools for hundreds of years, does not mean it's true. And we have to put on our critical lens of discussing it and unpacking it and thinking about where we're getting our sources from. Who's writing the sources? Are they reputable? Do you feel comfortable sharing this with students? And I think personally, as a teacher, sometimes you're pretty rushed and you're kind of just grabbing, you know, any content or anything that will bolster what you're teaching and learning about. But I think if schools gave time, this would be my dream, if schools gave time for teachers to actually think deeply about the content they were choosing and the impact it had on their students and themselves, our education system would be much more transformative. Because right now, you know, we choose resources and sources that do deal with adversity and maybe racism or these concepts that might not be as powerful and also as authentic as they could be.
And have you had to have any difficult conversations with your colleagues, like, you know?
Yeah, great question. In terms of, just to clarify, in terms of with like Holocaust studies, like in that context, or, you know, as a teacher as a white teacher who's trying to learn more about First Nations truth telling, what would you like?
Just as a teacher, trying to learn more, but you just mentioned like several different really great things that people should be doing. So have you ever had like a difficult conversation where you've got a co-worker who might not be doing things the right way, and how did you kind of approach that?
Definitely. It's such a good question. And I think it's really difficult because a lot of the time in a teaching context, and maybe this will resonate with some of you teachers and educators out there, you form really close relationships with the people you work with and your colleagues. So to have these tough discussions and chats, for some people can be really easy and come naturally. For some people can be like, wow, there's a friendship at stake. So it feels a bit more difficult and a bit more murky. So yes, I have had difficult conversations. As someone who was really involved in the Reconciliation Action Plan at my previous school, I really wanted to work with the team to, you know, to get momentum around this area and embed First Nations perspectives into the curriculum and into the school. And there were some educators who were resistant towards it and who didn't think that we needed to give it as much airtime, or that we should focus on math and English. Okay, all those things are important. But just because we focus on truth telling and embedding First Nations perspectives doesn't mean that those things get put to the side. So essentially, how did I go about this conversation? I said to them why I thought it was important. I said to them why, for me as an educator, it is so inherently linked to character development and developing kids to be proactive citizens in Australia, and that without it, we're not doing education a service, because if we just educate about content and not about how we can make the world a better place, as corny as that sounds, what are we educating towards? Like, I'd like to think that we're educating for the greater good, and so that students from all ages can feel empowered to look at the world and be like, wow, there are things that are not going well, and I have a voice and I can do something about it. And I think that's kind of how I would approach that conversation. Another way I think that helped me in that conversation was, again, I wasn't trying to convince them, just kind of state my position, but I showed them kind of tangible resources that I've used and that worked really well and landed in the classroom. And I feel like, because teachers can be a bit apprehensive to integrate new ways of knowledge into the classroom, and they're also time poor, when they saw these resources and they saw that, you know, the impact it was having on the kids and the, you know, the practical components, they were like, oh, like I could do that. Like, I'll give that a go. And it became more tangible, and it became like, okay, I can dip my toe into the water, as opposed to like this massive thing of embedding First Nations perspectives, which is a whole long journey that we're all going on as educators. So yeah.
Cool. I'm going to remind everyone watching again, if you'd like to ask a question, please pop it into the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen. And we might just do one of those now. So we've got a good one here. As panelists, what do you think is stopping any school or state education system from teaching more about First Nations culture, language, and understanding of connection to country? Cherisse, would you like to go first?
I think it's that whole, I guess it's that whole truth-telling, you know, issue, is that if we start to tell the truth of how things are, it's that people have to take ownership of the history and of what's happened. And then you start to get people feeling like they might be responsible. So then you get that guilt that's coming through. So, and basically it's a whole, you know, we start to recognize the structures and the systems that were put in place that, you know, have done nothing but kind of deplete and, you know, disempower our mob. That's when we have to start being real about, okay, do we want to make a change? And now we have to overthrow all of these things that have been making it impossible for Aboriginal people to excel and succeed. And so I guess once we start to be, you know, telling the truth more, that's when you'll start to see, I guess, more action. We can really start to change and improve things for us. But until we do that, you know, nothing's going to change. And I think because with that truth-telling aspect, when we have to start making changes, it means we have to start invest, right? So people have to invest in these changes, which means government then has to invest. So yeah, I guess it's going to be a whole spiral sort of, or domino effect, in that once we start telling the truth, we have to be real about how we can make improvements and start to make things a bit more better. And I think for me personally, as an Aboriginal person, and I've kind of just come to this realization in the last few years, is that we're always going to be kept down. We're always going to be kind of left in this state of poverty and despair because we have survived 65,000 years. Imagine how powerful we would be as a community, as a mob, how much more further we would excel if we were given the skills, the resources, the funding to be able to, you know, pursue the things that we hold true. And so, you know, I have this idea that we're kind of always going to be left in this state. It's really great to have aspirations. I don't think anything's going to change in my lifetime, but you know what? We're here, we're working at it, we're surviving, and we just keep trying. So yeah, hope that answers that question.
To any of, or Cassie, I actually think it could be good to hear from you on that as well.
Thanks, Cherisse, for sharing that. Yeah, that was, yeah, I could really feel what you were saying, and yeah, just heard that. Just wanted to like make space for that. So in terms of the education system, what's preventing it from happening? Is that what us doing it? So I think it's not to get too philosophical, but I think it's and radical, but I guess it's children's ground, so let's go. I think it's that Australia is still in a very westernized, Eurocentric way of operating. And I think until we acknowledge politically that because our education system reflects the discourse that we choose to have in our society, in our country. So unless that starts to change, it will be very difficult for things on the ground to change. Because I think individual educators are doing it. And I think all of you educators who have showed up to this are doing it. Like, this is a step in your journey of doing that and reconciling with truth telling and what it means for you as a teacher to bring these things to the forefront. So I think right now, the Western, Eurocentric, white-centric view in our education system in Australia is that certain skills are valued and prioritised, and certain ways of being and knowing are prioritised. And until we acknowledge that the First Nations perspectives are, you know, can ground and anchor how we teach and how we educate, and I think Children's Ground does a good job of doing that. But until we realise that more as a whole in Australia, I think it'll be very difficult to change it. In saying that, though, there are great movements and strides being made. Like, I know Melbourne University, because I'm affiliated with them still, because I graduated with them as a Master's of Teaching student. I know they've got an Indigenous Australian and Torres Strait Islander curriculum they're developing. Like, Marsha Langton is really spearheading that with a lot of other great First Nations academics. And that idea is like making curriculum connections, you know, with math and science, with First Nations astronomy, and with First Nations land conservation and sustainability. So making those really tangible links. So I think there are things happening. And I know the Australian curriculum, from reading and thinking and talking about it, is going through a reboot in terms of integrating First Nations perspectives. But like, I very much think of it in a systems way. Like, if the system is not going to change, and, you know, the Australian society is still favouring a white-based narrative, a colonial narrative, and that's reflected in the curriculum in terms of the language they choose to use, like settlement as opposed to colonisation, then as educators, we are bound by the curriculum. So where do we go with that? So I think that's kind of my thoughts on the education system.
And I'll just jump in as well. Thank you both. Like you'd mentioned, Cherisse, you know, that these ongoing effects of colonisation, and it's colonisation globally, the effects of colonisation globally, and us as non-First Nations, or, you know, white individuals acknowledging that, and then, you know, what can we do to sort of change the system. We've just come out of Anzac Day a week or two ago, and you know, not a lot of, say, non-Indigenous Australians actually know or acknowledge about the Indigenous soldiers and what happened when they came back, not getting access to you know, all of the resources and everything that white soldiers did. And so it's, when we're talking about like systemic racism and structural racism, it permeates through every single facet of every single area in this country. And so they're really uncomfortable truths, but they're truths that we sort of need to acknowledge. So acknowledging that, you know, stolen wages isn't really talked about as well. Like, we talk about stolen children and stolen, you know, stolen land, but the stolen wages and the ongoing effects of that as well. So it's really important that we acknowledge that it sort of goes through every single facet of not only this country, but, you know, the effects of colonisation globally.
Thanks, guys. We've got another great question from Rob. As a Black educator, I've been sharing my lived experience in workshops. What I noticed is it's well received, but I'm questioning the cost to me. How does the panel think we, as truth tellers, look after ourselves? Who wants to go first?
I can answer that as a Aboriginal person. I think, you know, the way that, because we have a lot of, you know, stuff that we carry in our roles, and even, you know, for me at Children's Ground, I might work as a head of health, but I wear at least 5 different hats on a different day. So it's really about taking time out and, you know, doing the things that you love to do and that you enjoy, and surrounding yourself with people, you know, and just, I guess, having those opportunities where you can talk about your experiences to your peers, to your family, the people that you're close with, which is other Aboriginal people. And I think, you know, for me, it's taking time out, like going on country, you know, spending time with my kids and doing things outside of planned things. We just kind of like pack up the car and we drive out, and then we go out and sit in the creek and, you know, just kind of being being on country, but being with family. And I think we have to try and share that load amongst us. So, you know, if you are doing a lot of the speaking and you are kind of carrying a lot of that, sometimes it's really hard. I know it's hard to step out, but sometimes you just have to step out and, you know, give opportunities to others, or even just letting people know that they have the ability to be able to step up and speak and be a part of some of that truth telling. So, you know, that's probably stuff that you hopefully already do. But for me, that's the sort of stuff that, you know, I have to work on. But it's very difficult to say no, especially when an opportunity comes up to, you know, be a part of this truth telling. Sometimes it is that we have to, you know, be a bit selfish and let someone else step in. So yeah, just look after yourself.
I think I can answer this too, actually. So I used to be a journalist, a First Nations Affairs journalist. I'm Gumaro myself, and that also was really hard to go and do a story with a family that's been very traumatized, and it may, in some cases, it was stuff that had happened to my family too. So you go in there and you feel their pain and you sit down with them and you get to know them, and then when you go away from that, like, you want to help them, but all you can do is kind of write a story. That took a lot of, like, it really affected me with my mental health and stuff. So I ended up walking away from journalism for a little while. And now I work at this amazing place. So yeah, but I agree with what Cherisse said, with you just got to be selfish sometimes. And, you know, you can't help everyone or change the world, but you can, you know, put some of yourself into it.
Thanks, Cherisse and Maddie. That was beautiful. And I think also the onus is also on like non-First Nations individuals to jump in and step in if there's people asking sort of silly questions that they could Google, if we can take on the load or sort of like share that sort of emotional or mental load where appropriate, to sort of save sort of First Nations or individuals to have to kind of like do extra work. So I think it's really important, again, coming back to us educating ourselves enough so that we can jump in when it's appropriate, to sort of save extra effort that, say, a Cherisse or a Maddie, if we can do that. And that's where that constant and ongoing educating of yourself and ensuring that you're looking after your fellow staff members and friends and well-being as well.
Yeah, just to jump into what Anthea was saying about, you know, I think that's why I've managed to, you know, do so well in Children's Ground in terms of my own mental health, because we do have those non-First Nations staff that, you know, that are looking out for us and that are checking in constantly and making sure that we're not taking on too much and not trying to then kind of pile more onto our plate. And so I think that a lot of the work and I guess a lot of that, you know, is from those non-First Nations mob, you know, just giving support and just backing us up. And in different situations where I've been lucky to being able to, you know, go off and speak to someone who is a white person who works in my organization and being able to offload, or, you know, they might not be able to do some of the hard, difficult stuff that, you know, where you need an Aboriginal person's perspective, but they can definitely, you know, lay some of the foundations down and give support to you and just kind of checking in when things, you know, when we have those difficult things come up in the media and we have these difficult, you know, stories and comments being made, and, you know, just kind of checking in and saying, you know, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Sometimes that's all it takes, is just makes you feel like, oh, actually someone actually cares about what I'm saying. So just to kind of build on Anthea's comments. Yeah.
I think also when there is a big, like a difficult event happening in the media, for you know, like a death in custody or something, check in with your Black friends and ask them, are they okay, or your colleagues, how they're feeling, if they want to talk. But obviously don't force them to speak to you about it, but just checking in to see if they're okay is really important as well. I had another question for Anthea. Sorry, I'm just finding it. So as a white woman, how do you speak out when you see injustices happening to your kids or to First Nations people in general?
Thanks, Maddie. And again, like sort of educating yourself so that you know what you're sort of talking about or saying the right thing, and always giving permission for First Nation. Like if I say something wrong, or if a First Nations individual sees me saying something, it's important for them to also like pull me up or call me out. And you did this in a really nice way, Maddie, when I think I did a acknowledgement, and I said past, present and emerging, and you just did it very privately, separately, and said, you know, we don't say you know, emerging. And so I've changed my my wording, and I think it's really important to be called out and to take on board what feedback you get given, because it's always meant with love. So whenever somebody calls out, or if I see something that doesn't sit right, or it doesn't quite sound right, or just try and have a conversation, always thinking about, say, my family or my kids, or how would I want someone to call it out to protect my kids and my family. And I think actually, you know, when I was talking about Professor Tracy Bunda before, oftentimes I'm thinking about, like, would I make her proud, or would she, you know, what would she think if I didn't call it out? And so it's a constant learning thing, that just doing it in a way that, you know, that is making sure that people sort of understand, and that there is so much learning, and just trying to bring it back to just educating yourself on things, and ensuring that we're all, you know, do the work, read the books, listen to the, you know, people that we need to listen to. And I think that it can be done. It's important to stand out, whether that's with your friends, if you have like racist comments in a friendship circle, because if you don't say something, that's as much as like letting it slide. So call out if people are making sort of unnecessary comments in the workplace, in any situation. So it's just really important to and sometimes you might get a bit nervous about doing it, but just really thinking that it's really important to, again, on what we were saying about that mental load for other First Nations individuals as well. If you don't call it out, it's just going to continue. So it's something that's important.
Oh, someone has asked to elaborate on the emerging elder thing. So it can be a personal thing, but we don't have emerging elders in our communities. Like, that's just not a thing for us. We have community leaders, I guess, or activists and whatever else. That's why when I say my acknowledgement to country, I just say, like, want to acknowledge the really hard work that those people on the ground are doing to make our communities better. But I just feel like emerging is inappropriate terminology, because it implies that it's an actual thing that we have in our communities, when we don't really have that. You're an elder or you're not.
And can I just say for that one as well, you know, the way that people kind of come into that status of being an elder, that's not kind of like, you're not kind of put in that position because of a family connection or because of the power that you hold. That's something that through, you know, acknowledgement of the work that you've been doing, that the community identifies you as an elder. And so not everyone that's old is an elder. Like, just think of it like that, because some people, and I know William, he's the chair of the board for Children's Ground, William Tilmouth. He often goes on about people, you know, acknowledging him as uncle quite a lot. And he says, oh, you know, I don't like people calling me uncle. And I think it is that personal choice of, you know, people can identify to be an uncle or an aunt if that's what they choose to be, or a nana or a pop, or however they want to be identified. But I think that it's not up to you as the person to kind of just put that onto that person. And that eldership thing is, some people can be really, you know, it takes a lot of, some people can be really, I guess, sort of shy about having ownership of that title of being an elder. But I think it is that the community has to, you know, has together determined that this person is an elder. But that's not to say that someone who's of similar age to them, it can also be an elder. And so when you're talking about having an emerging elder, well, how do we decide who is an elder and who is not? And then how can we dictate who is an emerging elder? We can have emerging leaders, and that's something that I've heard quite a lot. And we have leaders of our communities, and we always talk about leaders and seniors and elders within our community. But I think it's just, it's quite difficult even for me when I hear this emerging elders or emerging leaders, is that, well, how do we know when they've kind of emerged? How do we know when they've reached elder status? It's not something that, you know, someone goes to university and becomes a doctor or is a professor. It's not something that you can train for. It's just kind of something that happens fluidly. You know, it just happens naturally. It's not something that we can determine. Yeah.
Can Okay, we haven't heard from Cassie in a little while, and so we're getting a little bit derailed. So this is a question for Cassie. It's anonymous. Do you think Jewish children understand their responsibility for ensuring the history of human rights for Jewish people is never forgotten? For example, do Jewish children or young people become the voice for the next generation on stopping such atrocities like the Holocaust?
What a great question. Thank you so much. I think from lived experience, yes. I think there are organizations, and that's what I spoke to when I introduced myself. There are youth groups that their purpose is to support in the Jewish community this sense of voice, and for young people to feel like they can bring about social change that is just and that benefits the wider society. So I think, like the youth group I was a mentor within and I grew up in, that was a really progressive space where these things were embedded in the way that you grew up. So you could choose to then take responsibility for your immediate Jewish community. And I think we're very lucky as a Jewish person that we have that, you know, the socioeconomic, I would say, you know, status in the sense, I can only speak from my personal experience, where we have the resources to have these inbuilt structures of organizations and youth groups. And it's a shame when this is not afforded to all communities that should have these spaces to be speaking about atrocities and how that's directly impacted upon them. So I will acknowledge my privilege in that, and being able to grow up in a space that that allowed us to engage with these concepts with our community. So I think it does. I think as a person who grew up in a progressive Jewish community, you feel that weight to speak out against injustices and to not be a bystander across the board in terms of when you see things happening in the world, or for me personally on my own educational journey, seeing the issues that exist in Australia in terms of in the way that we, you know, don't give enough light and weight to First Nations perspectives. That I think is, as a Jewish person, I think we are, well, I'd like to say I'm more likely, or I want to be more likely to speak out. I think everyone has that in them. I think we all don't want to be bystanders, but I think when you've had that experience in your community and that intergenerational trauma, then you are more likely to speak out against atrocities.
Thanks, Cassie. All right, well, I'll do one last question, and this is for each of you. It's from Anonymous. Does the panel have any experiences they could share to give them hope for change?
I'll jump in. I think definitely hope for change and definitely hope for the future. So just like I was mentioning previously before, so as a white woman with an Aboriginal husband and Aboriginal children, I think that I see sort of this every day. And I think having Russell grown up on Amiwara Mission in Port Augusta and having that sort of very, you know, challenging and traumatic childhood, and to see this, like how he's taken that on to be this like amazing father, and sort of not having access to education or access to like shoes and socks and food and everything, to being this amazing father for our children and taking this really, really seriously and picking the kids up and dropping them off, and being an active member of the community and being sort of part of everything, and being a musician and on the road, and sort of doing he's about to do his own music as well, release his own album. A lot of the things that he talks about on there is about you know, how like hopeful it is for the future and really exciting. And I think it's just again, like I said, the onus on us as non-Indigenous or non-First Nations people to do the work, to do all the reading that you can, to uplift First Nations voices. And I think it's a really beautiful thing to do, and it is really exciting. And yeah, I think I can't wait to see where we go, and having staff members like Cherisse and yourself, Maddie, and all the other First Nations staff in this organisation is really inspiring as well. So definitely exciting and hope for the future.
What was that question again, Maddie? It was about.
Sorry, do you have
we're
any experiences? Yeah, do you have any experiences that you could share that has like something that's happened that's given you hope for change?
I think there's lots of different, there's so many different examples from this last year and a bit that I've been working at Children's Ground, where I've seen people, First Nations mob communities, just like rally together and just be immediately responsive to something that's happened, whether it's been in the media, whether it's Children's Ground putting a statement together, you know, whether it's something that's happened in our community through Surrey Business or through any kind of other event which has caused, you know, the day-to-day work to kind of stop or shut down. And so like that, to me, I'm hopeful, because, you know, a lot of the time we're always thrown this idea that Aboriginal people are lazy, you know, they don't want to work, they don't like to mobilise, they don't want to organise their own stuff, they just sit back and take handouts. But I've seen so many people this year step up and step into leadership and step into roles that are really outside their comfort zone. And I've seen young men who are, you know, trying to get their licence, and I've seen women that are taking on new skills and owning, you know, and owning their own cultural skills and their own language skills, and kind of then going out and teaching young ones and teaching other community members. So I think just seeing the work that's being done, you know, with Children's Ground, I feel hopeful, because, you know, these are the people that are role modelling for our children. Our children are seeing them and wanting to, you know, be like them, whether it is, you know, driving a coaster bus, or, you know, whether it is learning how to make bush medicines or to cook damper. Like, kids are watching and kids are learning. And so that, to me, like, brings hope, because, you know, we always talk about, you know, starting early with the kids, and we want to inspire children and kind of have them growing up. But it's also that flow-on effect from children to, like, their parents and their siblings, aunties, uncles, nana, pops, their elders in their community. Like, we're inspiring that kind of change. And then for me, I just, you know, I love my kids engaging in culture and language, and I love that they can come to Children's Ground and feel like they're at home. And I know that there are families that are, you know, keeping an eye out for them and having some responsibility of them. That kind of, it's that whole thing of that community raising the kids, and I love that feeling, and I love that for my children. So yeah, there's so many different things that bring hope, but obviously, you know, and even having webinars like this, having a conversation where we've got 50, 60 people online that are wanting to learn and willing to listen and make changes, that inspires hope. Yeah.
Cassie, what about, like, from an education perspective? You're muted.
There had to be one incident of that. You're muted. So connecting to what Anthea and Cherisse said, I think yeah, change is coming. It obviously is slow, particularly with these issues. But from an educator's perspective, the things that give me hope for change is seeing the look and sparkle in, you know, predominantly the settings I've been on, non-First Nation students' eyes, when you share with them the amazing accomplishments and achievements of First Nations peoples, and you celebrate the culture, and you bring that to the forefront of what you're teaching. Because from my experience, the students want to learn these things, and they're gritty. They want to get to the deep, you know, the depths of what's going on and why did it happen. So as a teacher, I do have hope. I think the hope is in our students, because they're critical thinkers, and they will challenge us and they will question us. So I think we have to be honest and we have to be truth tellers. So I've got hope, because they're amazing generations coming through. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. I'm sorry we didn't get through all the questions again. But it's really nice to see how many questions we get every time we have one of these webinars. Don't forget to sign up to sign your school or workplace up for Wear It Yellow. It's at the end of May during National Reconciliation Week. There's a link in the chat that you can go on to register. It's really easy, and we provide free educational resources for everyone who signs up. And if you enjoyed the work of, enjoyed this webinar and the work that we do, please consider donating to us. There's also a link of that in the chat as well. Thanks, everyone.